Take it, Robert.
All right, folks, welcome back to the Modjeska School for Human Rights. Now, tonight we're going to be covering primarily the years 1945 until 1954, essentially from the end of the Second World War up until the Brown v. Board decision. Now, on the study guide, if you first enter it, it says that is what we're doing tonight. But if you click on it, it says 1945, 1963. We're only going to go up to 1954 because, as you're about to see, there's a great deal that occurs both in South Carolina history and the history of the U.S. and the world between World War II and the Brown v. Board case. In fact, it's actually really important for us to slow down tonight to discuss this decade-long period because it marks a watershed in ideas surrounding civil rights and human rights in American and world history. So we're going to go ahead and get started tonight really by talking about a pivotal figure in both South Carolina's domestic history, internal history, and also America's history abroad. And of course, let me go ahead and share my screen. I am talking about James Byrnes. Let me go ahead and get to that. Now, as I've said it before, and I've taken great pains to reiterate this every week of the class, what we're really talking about in this class, in the Modjeska School for Human Rights, is not simply South Carolina's history. Because the thing is that, and sorry, I have to take this joke from the infamous line of commercials, what happens in South Carolina doesn't stay in South Carolina. Unfortunately, that's usually a bad thing, especially if we're talking about folks like James Byrnes, John C. Calhoun, Strom Thurmond. There is a good argument to be made that most of the critical ideas that are inherent within the history of American conservatism have their origins in South Carolina. Or at the very least, they were buttressed by people from South Carolina, many of whom have statues at the State House grounds right here in Columbia, South Carolina. But James Byrnes, or as he was known during his time in office, Jimmy Byrnes, he really exemplifies what this looks like on a global stage. Now, Jimmy Byrnes essentially occupied every possible important office you can think of, except the offices of president and vice president. And quite frankly, it's almost a surprise that didn't happen. But Byrnes, like Calhoun a century before, has numerous different positions within the state government of South Carolina and then the federal government of the United States. He's a congressman, he's a senator, he's a governor. At the end of World War II, however, Byrnes is Secretary of State. And in fact, by 1945, Byrnes was actually a key cog in the National Democratic Party. He was really one of the most important figures in the National Party, which is actually quite ironic considering that last week when we last met, we ended by talking about the Progressive Democratic Party's attempts to actually push for a more biracial representation of South Carolina at the Democratic National Convention in 1944. And yet here we have Jimmy Byrnes being one of the most important men in both the party and the government being from South Carolina. Now, Byrnes as Secretary of State represents how two big events going on in America or soon to occur in America are going to combine and really collide with one another. On the one hand, of course, you have the civil rights struggle at home within the United States, the fight against legalized white supremacy. On the other, as World War II is coming to an end, if you were to talk to any important American strategist or thinker about the future of American diplomacy, they would have told you, even as World War II was winding down, that the next big enemy for the United States, in our eyes, is going to be the Soviet Union. Even though the Soviets were allies during World War II, even though if you look at every statistical marker, the Soviets actually fought the bulk of the German army during the war, there is a sense that after the war is over, the world will be divided between the United States and her allies versus the Soviet Union and their allies. But for Jimmy Byrnes, he really saw these different things, these, on paper at least, disparate elements of civil rights and the Cold War really combining into one, even as the war is coming to an end. Now, Brett, did you want to actually talk about Jimmy Byrnes and the end of the war? Because I know that you're really excited to talk about that particular topic.
Well, yeah, Robert, thank you. Just in that it is in trying to keep some kind of chronological clarity here. Robert has already stressed the significance of Byrnes, but if you appreciate that Mr. Byrnes was the acolyte that took over Ben Tillman's role. And so that this white supremacist torch keeps burning brightly, not just in South Carolina, but in the nation. And Byrnes was positioned to where he could have been vice president, maybe president. He was referred to as Roosevelt's assistant president, except that he said he can't come off his white separatist, white supremacy position and retain his power in South Carolina. And so that leads us to Mr. Byrnes being Secretary of State in 1945. Roosevelt's dead. Truman inherits a horrible war. The war is winding down, and I've heard most of my adult life any number of observations that the atomic bombs did not need to be dropped on Japan, and that it was quite clear that Japan had their back against the wall. It was just a matter of working something out with them. And that there's a good book now by David Robertson called Sly and Able. And it's not new, it's new to me, but it's more than 10 years old. And Robertson gets deeper into it than I had seen, and outlining the position that Byrnes played as Secretary of State in the White House, making decisions, and he was the only one championing dropping the bombs now. And the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military was against it, the political people were against it, the scientists were against it. And we had heard, those that have studied this portion of history had heard and seen and read things that the scientists that had been involved in the Manhattan Project felt that you didn't need to kill people. You didn't need to bomb a civilian population. If you've got to drop the bomb, do it on an island, so y'all watch that island disappear. Byrnes insisted. And one of the reasons Byrnes insisted is he was one of the first people that to really master shifting the blame of people of color in this country wanting their own freedom to communist. I mean, our Negroes couldn't possibly figure this out. It's somebody's coming in here and stirring it up and telling them they're oppressed. And that was Byrnes' trump card for carrying on I guess we would call it after the stone cold segregationist period of Tillman, the James Crow, the slightly, Modjeska called it the Klan in suits, that the idea was that people were being manipulated by communists. So it wasn't our bad people, it was these bad people coming in. And so Byrnes insisted that the bomb be dropped, and it was dropped. And what he wanted to do was to get in front of the Soviets, use the bomb and put them on defensive, but also to be able to control the world stage as that communism was the big enemy. Now, if you remember in last class, we talked about, and maybe in class 2, anti-socialism being something that people talked about to retain slavery. They said that if you make people equal, we're going to lose our slaves. Socialism is equality, and we can't have that. That's not going to make us lose the power. And so there's this kind of this continuum that South Carolina's leadership has that comes from the Barbadian influence right on up through the Lost Cause that is still going. That it has influenced not just South Carolina, not just the nation, but global politics. So we'll get more into Burns and global politics as we move on through this decade. What I'm speaking to you now was 1945, and so we're starting now picking up before Burns comes back to South Carolina as the governor. So back to you, Robert.
Yeah, and certainly what this also reminds us of is, again, how so many of the issues we've discussed so far, whether it's racism, America's standing in the world, South Carolina standing within the United States, how all these issues intersect in a lot of interesting ways, especially once World War II comes to an end. Now, the thing about the war is that, as was the case with the Great War, the Second World War does produce, or I don't want to say produces, but does push a greater militancy among many returning African-American veterans. Now, for those of you who study, say, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, most of the older leaders of those movements were folks who actually served in World War II. There were a lot of people who came back home. And think about this, put yourself in the shoes of Black Americans who fought in the Pacific or in South Asia or North Africa or Europe. They've seen other parts of the world. They've seen how race works in, say, Britain or France or India or Australia. And most importantly, they have spent the last 4 years hearing from their own government about the need for the nation to fight for freedom, about the need to fight for democracy. Now, all the propaganda being put out by the United States and her allies during the war talks about how the United States is fighting for freedom, for democracy, and African Americans were saying, that's great. Those are fantastic ideas. Let's actually try those at home. And so what you're seeing by 1945, and this builds up during the war, you have people, African Americans involved in NAACP and other organizations around the country who during the war are already saying, hey, when this war comes to an end, we are not going to just sit idly by and allow Jim Crow segregation to continue on. We're going to demand significant change, as was the case at the end of the Great War. But this time, something a little bit different happens because you begin to see the white South responding to this newfound militancy amongst African Americans. This brings me to Isaac Woodard. Now, in 1945 and 46 especially, if you were to go back and read newspapers, newsreels, if you saw any of those from the time period, you would hear many, many stories from across the South of Black veterans being beaten, being murdered, being lynched, even in their own uniforms, coming home from the war. Now, there is this understanding amongst many white Southerners that service in the military is a unique marker of citizenship. This is why Black Americans have really fought for fighting in wars for so long. This actually changes a lot with Korea and especially Vietnam. We'll get to that a little bit later. But there's this sense that if you serve the country, if you fight for the country, that is the greatest marker of citizenship possible. And so after World War II comes to an end, you have numerous stories of Black veterans being attacked. In South Carolina, the best known example of this, although not the only one, is Isaac Woodard. Now, Isaac Woodard is the man you see in the center of this picture on the left-hand side of the screen. He is being helped up the stairs by, to his left, or rather to his right, the heavyweight boxing champion, Joe Louis. Woodard, the story goes that Woodard served in the Pacific during World War II. He returned home in 1945. He got on the bus near Camp Gordon now. Well, he was on a bus that passed through Camp Gordon, now Fort Gordon near Augusta. He was passing through South Carolina on a bus on the way to see his folks. Now, what's funny is that in the national news stories about Isaac Woodard, initially it was said that he was beaten and blinded in Aiken, South Carolina. It wasn't entirely accurate. It was actually Bamberg, South Carolina. But what is significant is how this story actually develops. Woodard is on the bus. He's taking the bus. He asks the bus driver, hey, can we pull over? I need to use the bathroom. The bus driver says no. Woodard, again, is a guy who's seen war. He's served overseas. He's really incensed by the fact that the bus driver won't even honor this very simple request. So he talks back to the bus driver. The bus driver eventually stops the bus near Bamberg, South Carolina. This is where he calls the local police. The police show up. They question Woodard. And what happens is that Woodard is then beaten by the police. So badly, in fact, as you can see from the photograph here, that Woodard is actually blinded for the rest of his life. He is kept in jail overnight. The story quickly becomes national and international news. And the tragedy of Isaac Woodard really becomes an example to the country of what's happening to Black veterans right after the war comes to an end. Now, the thing about Isaac Woodard is that Woodard and what happens to him becomes a cause. It becomes a crusade for some Americans. And when I say it becomes part of national media, I truly mean it. Woody Guthrie, the famous folk singer, writes a song about Isaac Woodard. I think it's titled The Ballad of Isaac Woodard. Orson Welles had a popular radio program back in the 40s, and he actually spent significant chunks of his own radio show talking about what happened to Isaac Woodard. In fact, if you look through your study guide, we actually have links to the Orson Welles broadcast from 1946 about what happens to Isaac Woodard. Suffice to say, the saga of Isaac Woodard and it becoming national news and international news really forces the state of South Carolina to at least try to address this issue. Now, keep this in mind. This is 1945, 46. This is not only when the war is coming to an end, not only is the Cold War about to start up, but you have had a few years of lynchings in the South, actually declining in number somewhat. But then you see a spike after World War II all across the South of veterans, Black veterans being murdered across the region. You're seeing Black veterans being murdered by the Klan, by other groups, just being murdered at night for a wide range of reasons. But there is this sense amongst the white South that the rhetoric of World War II, the rhetoric of democracy and freedom, has put the region's Jim Crow traditions under siege. You've heard this term before, white backlash, this idea of whenever there are advances in civil rights history or for Black Americans in America, there is a significant white backlash. There are some historians, though, who would tell you that actually it's not quite as simple as that, that the idea of white supremacy, the people who uphold white supremacy, they are always on guard against any attempt to undermine that white supremacy. So you certainly want to think about what happens to Isaac Woodard as an example of upholding white supremacy. Now, the Woodard case, what's happening across the country, indeed, even what we discussed last week, is part of what historians like to refer to as the long civil rights movement. Now, I don't want to get too bogged down into how historians talk about this era or any era, except to say that if you're looking at how people think about and write history now, especially when it comes to race relations, it's a bit different from what it was even 20 years ago. Now, I think a lot of you, when you think about the civil rights movement, you think about the push, the crusade for civil rights. Often most folks begin it with the Brown v. Board decision, or they begin it with the murder of Emmett Till, or the Montgomery bus boycott, all events in the 1954-55 time range. But as you saw last week, and as I want to detail more this week, really, when we think about civil rights now, it's more of starting back during the New Deal, the 1930s. This isn't to say that African Americans weren't fighting for their freedom long before that. Certainly in this class, we've talked about that a great deal. But the rhetoric of the New Deal and especially World War II really transforms how Americans engage with this idea of white supremacy, from it being just an issue in the South or just being the way things are, to people making direct comparisons between Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow South. Comparisons that many white Southerners are not comfortable with for obvious reasons. And you look at this poster on the screen. This is an actual wartime poster. It says, "United we win." Again, that kind of idea, that kind of outlook on American society as being a place that at least the US government is saying can accommodate folks of different ethnicities and races. This is an idea that human rights activists across the country are going to latch onto in the years and decades after World War II. Now, I want to zoom out from Isaac Woodard for a moment from the South and really talk about what the strategies were that the NAACP and other groups were using during this time period. And I'd be remiss if I did not mention that already before World War II, the NAACP is pursuing a largely legal strategy to try to push back against Jim Crow segregation. Now, Brett has talked before about how, and we'll get some more on this tonight and next week, how you can think about a human rights campaign that folks like Modjeska Simkins and W.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson and others were involved with during and after World War II versus the civil rights movement that we're more used to, the one that is focused a bit more on legal rights, on equality before the law and so forth, but is a bit tentative to address bigger questions of economic equality and justice and the like. The NAACP itself really pursued two main strategies in the 30s and 40s. The big one for them was trying to fight and destroy segregation through the legal system. When it begins under folks like Charles Hamilton Houston in the 1930s, the idea is not we're going to desegregate the South right off the bat. For many NAACP lawyers, they're saying, well, can we at least push the South to adopt the equal part of separate but equal? Their goal is to really push the South in the 1930s and early 40s to, if they're going to keep segregation going, at the very least to put more money and more effort and time into creating decent, well-funded schools for African Americans, not just for K through 12 education, but also for colleges and certainly for, and especially for graduate and law school education. So for example, I have a case on the screen right here, Missouri Gaines v. Canada in 1938, where there was a young man in Missouri who actually petitioned for entry into University of Missouri's law school. Now, he was African American, and he was told by the school, no, you can't enter here because you're Black. The NAACP argued before the Supreme Court that, well, if we're going to say separate equal is allowable, and it's allowable under the Constitution, then that means each Southern state should have a law school for African Americans, should have, say, a dental school for African Americans. In other words, you have to provide some sort of facility of higher education for Black people. Now, the NAACP sees this as a way to kind of chip at the system. And in fact, in South Carolina in 1938, Charles Bailey, who was a graduate, I believe, of Allen University, actually applies to USC's law school in 1938. The NAACP initially supports Bailey in his attempt to desegregate the law school, because they're thinking, well, the state of South Carolina will have to, at the very least, set up a separate school for Blacks. However, the state legislature quickly passes a bill saying, we will never do that. We will never allow a fund to be appropriated for a separate law school. And by 1940, Bailey just gives up on the case. The NAACP even admits to him, we want to fight this case for you in the 1930s, but right now we just don't have the resources. Keep in mind, if there was a big civil rights case in the 30s and 40s, 99% of the time, the NAACP was taking it up. So their resources are stretched pretty thin trying to fight all these legal battles. But we'll actually come back to this idea of a separate law school because it will come up later on tonight. I just wanted to point out again that across the South, there are lynchings, beatings, murders of African-American veterans. In 1946, in the summer of that year, there is a rash of new killings of Black veterans in Georgia and Alabama and really across the South. Again, you want to keep this in context, right? The country as a whole is rapidly changing in terms of how people are thinking about race and racism. And really, the late 1940s represents this fulcrum point in American history where so much is up in the air, not just about race, by the way, but about things like economic inequality. The fact that the American left is trying to hold on to not just this idea of the New Deal, but trying to expand upon it. Shortly before he died, President Franklin Roosevelt in 1945 gives a speech where he talks about a second Bill of Rights, which is going to be more economic in form and is going to do things like guarantee a decent education for all and things like that. On the ground in South Carolina, you do have, and across the South, you do have groups, not just the NAACP, that are trying to push for equality and freedom. And in fact, I want to let Brett talk about one of those right now. Let me see if I can pull up. Okay, so I want to get to this, and I'll go back and talk about a couple of other things. But we do want to talk a bit about the Southern Negro Youth Congress.
May I ask a question before we go?
Please go ahead.
I know that after the World War I, during the Red Summer, that it's very well documented that the returning veterans actually fought back during the many times. Did that happen after World War II?
Yes. So I'm glad you asked that. So you do have Black veterans who are fighting back after World War II as well. The big difference is that with the 1919 Red Summer, the veterans are fighting back during these massive riots. Now, in the aftermath of World War II, you don't have, at least not yet, the big riots going on. But during the war, during World War II, there are several race riots across the country, including most notably in Detroit in 1943. Harlem has one around the same time. There are riots in Texas, all over the place, where there are stories of both Black veterans and Blacks who aren't even in the military who are actually fighting back. And also, Dr. Gallman, to your point about fighting back, and this is kind of going a bit forward in the class, when we get to the 50s and 60s and the actual civil rights campaigns in the Deep South, like the Mississippi Freedom Summer and so forth, a lot of the people who are pushing for armed self-defense were World War II veterans, most notably just people across the South who were saying, we have training in using weapons, we have the right to defend ourselves. So certainly in some of these racial incidents after World War II, Black veterans are defending themselves. And this is going to be a repeated debate amongst human rights and civil rights activists, which is, do we need to actually arm ourselves for self-defense, or should we go with civil disobedience? Most people in the movement are saying, sure. They're open to all options. They're seeing it more as a debate over tactics as opposed to a way of life where you have to do one or the other all the time. So any other questions before we talk about the original SNCC?
Dr. Greene, I have a question.
Go ahead, please.
Okay, so in the narrative, that I heard that this class and you are correcting about lynching, for example, that, well, first, acknowledging that violence is a tool of white supremacy continues. You know, I see like police brutality, for example, in the present as one of the many modern day examples of it. But when you started talking about what seemed like more widespread lynching into the 1940s, it created a sense of surprise in me, because the narrative that I had always been told was one of lynching being a late 1800s, early 1900s phenomenon because of people like Ida B. Wells and other anti-lynching campaigns, that were somewhat successful. Lynching of the sort that Ida B. Wells documented, in my head, decreased and became rare. Clearly that's wrong. And I don't want to divert us, too much, but I mean, if there are any resources, or what do you have to say about that? I mean, did it just fluctuate? Were anti-lynching campaigns totally ineffective? It just raised a lot of questions for me.
So first off, I want to say that the use of the term lynching here is not just the act of hanging someone. In the case of, for example, let me go back a couple of slides really quickly. In the case of the violence I'm talking about here with Monroe, Georgia, and Athens, Alabama, these people were beaten, they were tortured, and then they were killed, murdered. And when we talk about Willie Earle, which I'll come back to just a second, the same thing with him. What happens is that a lot of times when we use the term lynching amongst historians, it's not just the act of being hung by a mob. Oftentimes, lynching is really referring to, does a mob get organized to murder someone in the South? The thing is that you're right that lynchings do decrease on the whole. Like, it's in the 19 teens and 20s, there are many more lynchings than, say, in the 1940s. But those lynchings don't completely disappear. They occur every once in a while. They're a bit rarer. But one of the reasons for that is that when we talk about lynchings by the 1940s and 50s, it's less about lynchings in the South, and it's more of things like the police, for example, using their power against Black men and women, as was the case with Isaac Woodard. Or you think about other forms of organized violence targeting African Americans. So when we talk about lynchings and what African Americans are facing in the South in the 40s, especially, it's a combination of lynchings and other ways in which white Southerners are organizing themselves and pooling their resources to intimidate African Americans, whether it be through literal murder and death, whether it be through beatings, or, as we're going to talk about later this evening, economic violence, threats against the jobs and livelihoods of African Americans. In short, enforcing white supremacy takes on a ton of different forms. Lynching is just one that we associate with a particular time period for good reason, but there are many different ways that this system is being enforced against African Americans. Okay. Let me see.
Well,
Robert, go ahead, please.
I wanted to point out to Julia that the History Denied book that is on page 30, that's the book that pretty much captures this period in time in this booklet that Becky did. There's 2 pages on lynching. And the one that was categorized as a lynching that most recent South Carolina was the Willie Earle case in Greenville in the 40s. And I marched with Kumeyamu Marsharia probably in the 70s in a situation that we consider to be a modern lynching, which didn't have a rope in a tree. It just had the police beating a person with disabilities to death in Winsboro. And so the term lynching has morphed into mob violence. And now they're using the anti-lynching law, which is the same now as it was a long time ago, basically to harass young Black people getting in fights. So some things change, but they remain the same. But I wanted to share some stories that I think are really provocative about when we started the Modjeska School. We didn't know, other than just reference, that Modjeska had started a school. And we knew about the, well, naturally we didn't know about her school. We knew that she worked with the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And in this book that I'm scrolling through here on the screen, this is one of the centerpieces of this book. And the talk about Becky's introduction in this is a cautionary tale. It centers on the Southern Negro Youth Congress, a militant interracial youth movement that thrived against all odds between 1937 and 1949. This is a militant, multiracial, basically an anti-imperialist class conscious movement that was completely erased, completely erased. Many friends that are professional historians talk about how completely this was erased. I was wondering why on earth this event that we see here at the Township Auditorium in 1946 in October, why was this literally an internationally focused event with delegations from Africa and South America, with W.E.B. Du Bois as a keynote, and that's Paul Robeson there at the train station here in Columbia. What? Why was it in Columbia? I mean, we don't have, to my knowledge at the time, the type of stellar history in terms of that militant leadership that would have prompted this. This is at a point now where Modjeska's already passed away. I spent the last nearly 20 years of her life with her and knew that Paul Robeson had been in her house and that she did this thing, but I didn't understand the dynamics and the way that the pieces fit together. And we talked about World War II and the soldiers and the tension about coming home to the Jim Crow South. We talked about Isaac Woodard getting blinded in Batesburg in February. We talked about Orson Welles lifting up the story in April in 5 national radio broadcasts. Before Zoom, this was before Zoom, 1946. And that at the same time, the last state in the nation to have a white-only primary is South Carolina. The Supreme Court had shut down Texas and Georgia, and the eyes of the world are now on South Carolina. Are y'all gonna do this, keep doing this? And Johnston, Governor Johnston calls a special session of the legislature and changes over 150 statutes to turn the Democratic Party into a private club. So this is in 1946. Well, that was actually in 44 leading up. It was bringing the attention to it because that case had not been resolved. Then there's the Elmwood case, that Robert, if you haven't spoken about it, we get to that where you did, you talked about that. And so this was a challenge to the white-only primary. And so there's all these bell-ringing things that are happening that are bringing focus on South Carolina. And at the time, the South Carolina NAACP, which Modjeska had been involved in the founding of the state conference in '39. Modjeska's mother had been involved in founding the Columbia branch in 1917. Modjeska's mother had been an original member in the Niagara movement with Du Bois. And so there's that family of Monteiths here in Columbia were raised with a global analysis of the problem, not just the South Carolina take on it. And they had a class conscious awareness that as if you read this through this 48-page book, there's words from their mouths at the time about building a multiracial class conscious movement, or we can't win the fight. We can't win the fight for human rights without a class conscious multiracial movement. And so that happened in '46. And I didn't really understand the power of it, the depth of it. I still couldn't figure out why it was here. I spoke at a conference in Tulane of voting rights, executive directors of voting rights organizations in 2016. This was before we did, I think it was either after or right before we did the class that year. And we knew that the Southern Negro Youth Congress had happened, but we didn't have much depth on it. And that year, when I spoke at Tulane, I quoted Modjeska to this group of executive directors from the southern states that had just lost the Section 5 protection of the Voting Rights Act from the Shelby case ruling in the Supreme Court. And said, you must keep doing this. And Modjeska, I didn't say Modjeska, I said, my mentor said, when asked, why do you keep doing this? Or how do you keep doing this? And year after year and decade after decade, she thought for a moment and she said, well, I guess I'm just selfish because it makes me feel good. We do this because it makes us feel good, not because we're going to win, because it needs to be done. And this fellow came up to me afterwards and he said, I know who your mentor was. I said, who? He said, Modjeska Simkins. I said, how do you know that? He said, I did my PhD thesis on Black history on the 1946 conference, Southern Negro Youth Congress conference in Columbia. Would you like the pages I got from the FBI? That opened the door for me. We now have the FBI files that talked about there being 400 and something delegates from South Carolina, talked about Modjeska starting 11 chapters of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Walterboro and other towns I can't remember. They talked about there being white people. And a lot of them were communists. The CIO was the labor organization. This is before the AFL and the CIO conjoined. And the CIO was one that had Operation Dixie. They were trying to organize working class people, black and white. And so there were unions present there. I think there were 170 white people. We know this because of the FBI files, which we should put online and make available because they are public record at this point. But it brought it home to the understanding that one of the things that was happening leading up to this was that the NAACP conference in South Carolina was seen as, legitimately as the cutting edge NAACP or state organization. Now, in 1944, before this conference, there was a delegation of the South Carolina Progressive Democratic Party that was organized that went and sent a majority black delegation. They may have been all black, but they had white people in the party when they founded it because they were completely shut out. They were completely shut out by the white-only primary. And they were refused to be seated at the National Convention of the Democrats 20 years before the Mississippi Freedom Party went, and Fannie Lou Hamer said she was tired of being tired. Everybody knows that. And that we didn't know that the Briggs versus Elliott case. Are you gonna get into that later, Robert? Well, we didn't know about the Briggs versus Elliott case being what it should have been, the Brown versus Board case, but we'll leave that for a moment. But there's so much that this exemplifies about how our history is erased. We did, after I found out about this and read the book that I've sent everyone a link to, the chapter 5 of Death Blow to Jim Crow. Chapter 5 is like a 40-page excerpt that Eric Gelman out of Roosevelt University in Chicago, wrote the first academic book on this in 2012. He came and spoke at a conference that we did in October 2016 on the 70th anniversary of this event. And the book, this is a picture I think that's in that book, but that book, the chapter is just about Columbia. And it's about Modjeska starting a school. And Modjeska started a school that year in 1946 at 2025 Marion Street. Well, that's where our office was in 2014 and 15 when we started organizing and planning the Modjeska School. We started a Modjeska School to teach leadership 70 years, it was 69 years actually, after she started a school in the same house we were in, because it was an unprecedented and valuable opportunity being offered to young South Carolinians, a leadership training school emphasizing the solution of problems of youth in our Southland. And they did it at Harbison Junior College, which is now a Midlands Tech place. And we did our 70th anniversary of the Southern Negro Youth Congress in the chapel at Harbison Junior College, where they had their first leadership training school. And so that she sent this to the community saying, it must be conceded at this very hour, more so than any time in history of this nation, there's an urgent need for the development of progressive thinkers to become the leaders of tomorrow. The Leadership Training School is planned to do just that. Now, if we could go back in time and get Modjeska to write a letter that we could use to gain support and raise money for the school, that's the letter. And so these are things that every time I reflect on it, I kind of get goosebumps. There's more about the Southern Negro Youth Congress in this book. Robeson not only sang, but he spoke and gave great stuff. Behold the Land was the speech, the keynote speech that W.E.B. Du Bois gave that could have been given today. And talking about how the black youth and the white youth have to get together. The future's theirs. And this is a picture of Modjeska's class of the leadership school at, this is at Allen University. No one at Allen University knew this happened. It happened in the township auditorium at a time when it was illegal for black and white people to be on the same floor with each other. No one on the county owns the township. No one on the staff of the township or on county council knew that this had happened. The primary lesson that the boys brought to that event in the township, they put up pictures of Black Reconstruction Congress people. Nobody knew then that the Reconstruction that they had learned about was a smashing success. The Reconstruction, the radical Reconstruction Constitution in South Carolina of 1868 was the most progressive document ever. And the books that we studied said a bunch of ignorant, superstitious Negroes were taken advantage of by the carpetbaggers. They lied to us. He came 70 years ago to tell people that 70 years before that, they lied to people for 70 years. Now, 70 years later, we're learning that Du Bois rang the bell about history being denied 70 years earlier. So kids, here's the lesson. It may come around and go around, but if we forget it, we're gonna have to live through it again. So I do encourage you all to read Becky's book and send comments and raise questions. Robert, that's what I got. I'm gonna give it back to you now.
Do we know any of the members of the class of 1946?
Yeah, Frank Washington was one of them. He's still alive. I saw him at Adele Adams' funeral recently. There are not many people left. Dorothy Burnham came and spoke. She's 104 in 2016. I'm not sure Dorothy's still with us. She was one of the young organizers. And one of the things that's happening in 46 is this is, the women were in leadership roles there. And that was rather unusual, certainly as we moved into the civil rights era dominated by the ministers. And so one of the things that I'm going to lift up and continue to lift up about what was happening then and why it was smashed was because they had a very threatening analysis that was a class analysis. It wasn't just about black people getting to vote. It was about human beings having rights, inherent rights, just like it says, you know, rights that came with the Constitution, rights that people practice in other countries, called healthcare and adequate jobs and housing. That's been a continual struggle, and we'll see that struggle reaching peaks in this country after the Spanish flu in 1918, after the Great Depression, and during when Roosevelt was in charge of the New Deal. These crises and opportunities where people realize, oh my God, the government can do this? Well, you can't stop doing it. That's how we got Social Security in 36. That's how we got Medicaid expansion during the Great Society. And so these opportune times, we need to learn from history about how you can move the ball rapidly. But this group here, 1946 in Columbia with the FBI all over it, they had their last conference in Birmingham 2 years later. Modjeska spent time on the road during that 2 years working on that conference. She got the vice presidential candidate, Senator, blank was his name, Taylor, from, where was he from, Robert? I can't remember.
Oh, give me a second.
But the senator,
Idaho.
Who's saying it?
Idaho. Frank Taylor was from Idaho, Brett.
Idaho. I knew it was somewhere way out there. And he was known as the singing cowboy because he was like a hippie. He had a guitar and sang protest songs at the State House. And he was chosen to be the vice presidential candidate with somebody that was running on a progressive ticket. Yeah. And that presidential candidate, help me, Robert.
Henry Wallace.
Yes, Henry Wallace. And Ms. Simkins talked about Wallace, and that was a big push. It was like the original Bernie Sanders. And that, so this guy was going to come to the conference, 1948 conference, the Southern Negro Youth Congress in Birmingham after the Columbia Conference. And that there was this gentleman in charge of the police in Birmingham named Bull Connors. You may have heard of Bull Connors. And that Bull kept shutting the churches down that were going to host the thing by scaring them. And so it went through 3 churches. They had they canceled their thing. And the 4th church, they got a 4th church, And they were going to do it. And the law in Alabama was at the time that you have to have a separate door for white people to come. And so they took a door off and turned it sideways so they could have two entrances. And Senator Taylor, he canceled. He canceled because they were all this buzz about being communist and all. And Modjeska got on the phone to him and talked him into coming. Senator Taylor went. He went through the colored only door, and Bull Connor arrested him and put him in jail. A sitting senator and a candidate for vice president of the United States of America. And there were no more Southern Negro Youth Congress meetings. That was the end of it. So the more effective you get, the more attention you draw, the more heat you get. There's another lesson. I'm going to be quiet now, Robert. Take it back.
Well, and one thing I wanted to do is I want folks to understand how important the Southern Negro Youth Congress was. Again, as Brett mentioned, it lasted from 1937 to 1949. So it begins during the Great Depression and goes through World War II. It reportedly had tens of thousands of members across the South. I mean, it wasn't like this small cadre of people. They had a lot of members across the South, many of whom were younger African-American men and women who grew up during the Great Depression, came of age during World War II, and are, like I said before, taking quite seriously the rhetoric of freedom and democracy that the nation had pushed throughout the world during the war. Before we go back to my PowerPoint, I do want to actually read just a small part of the Behold the Land speech, because I know the question was raised in the chat about this idea of what it means to, by Jenna, she raises the question, what does class conscious mean, right? And Du Bois's speech at the Behold the Land conference in 1946 exemplifies what people in the late 1940s were talking about, that many civil rights activists in the South were already making this case that the fight against racism, the fight against white supremacy, and the fight against oppressive forms of capitalism were actually against the same enemy, and that Black and white working class people actually had common economic and social interests. I'm going to go ahead. I'm just going to read this. I'm going to also share my screen really quickly. So you can actually find Du Bois's Behold the Land speech in the History Denied book that Becky Robbins crafted. Again, a great book, by the way, that you should check out if you haven't had a chance to do so. But I do want to just show you the first paragraph, and I'll read it. Now, Du Bois begins his speech with this paragraph. He says, "The future of American Negroes is in the South. Here, 327 years ago, they began to enter what is now the United States of America. Here, they have made their greatest contribution to American culture, and here they have suffered the damnation of slavery, the frustration of Reconstruction, and the lynching of emancipation. I trust then that an organization like yours is going to regard the South as the battleground of a great crusade. Here is the magnificent climate. Here is the fruitful earth under the beauty of the southern sun. And here, if anywhere on earth, is the need of the thinker, the worker, and the dreamer. This is the firing line, not simply for the emancipation of the American Negro, but for the emancipation of the African Negro and the Negroes of the West Indies, for the emancipation of the colored races, and for the emancipation of the white slaves of modern capitalistic monopoly."
Right on.
As Brett said a moment ago, this speech would not be that out of place today. He might not say Negro, but otherwise, I mean, this is why we really want to emphasize in the Modjeska School that all of you who are in this class this semester, you are part of a much larger tradition than any of us may even recognize or fathom. And especially being in South Carolina, that means that things like the Southern Negro Youth Congress, people like Modjeska Simkins and so many others, they saw this place as the center of that battleground. That is a place, you know, where freedom and democracy can be fought for. Now, really, real quick about the records of SNCC. Go ahead, Brett. Go ahead, please.
I've told several people that this particular time in history, if you study it in South Carolina, lets you understand better how and why you hear South Carolina had no problems during the kind of integration period. That was all in Mississippi and Alabama. It's because they dealt with it. And that one of the things that has struck me, that it took me many years, decades to find out, growing up in the South, being involved in the tail end of the Civil Rights Movement with the Southern Organizing Committee, 68 and 69, I was a state traveler working with people that revered Modjeska going back to the 30s, people that some were communists, but the organizations like the Southern Conference of Education and people that started Highlander. And so there was this deep history there, but that they had radical Black people there. In Georgia, I remember Tyrone Brooks being a radical representative in 68. You had Julian Bond in North Carolina. You had radical Blacks in the legislature. And there was a more organized, radical organizations, class-conscious organizations of people of color, but not in South Carolina. And I think this has a lot to do with it. And my experience in growing up in South Carolina as a radical, it was 92 when Representative Joe Neal and Gilda Cobb Hunter came into the legislature with a class consciousness about organizing beyond voting rights and talking about the human rights that we all deserve. And that the story continues in terms of that suppression of that militant approach when Modjeska is essentially, I've never really figured out a good term. She's like unceremoniously, kicked out of the NAACP state conference that she started when her name is left off the ballot for reelection. And that she wrote a letter that we have, I think it may be in Becky's book, but we produced a letter, if somebody wants to see it, to her people saying, I want you to know that wasn't my decision. I didn't forsake you. And what had happened was that the men that were Methodist and just different ministers of different ilk that wanted to be leaders just threw her under the bus as a communist. And so we had a change of leadership of the state conference to people that were more acceptable by the white power structure that had been all along white supremacist, that were moving slowly towards accommodating integration, but had a much better working relationship with I.D. Quincy Newman than they did Modjeska. And so that transition is something that explains a lot to me when I go back and look at it. And Robert, let me share, Jenna asked about, do we have the curriculum? And we just happened to, and I think that either Graham Duncan found this at Howard.
Yeah.
Graham went and dug around at Howard's archives. But this is the brochure from the 1946 school. And here's your application, educational experience, work experience. It's a lot like we ask you to be a student in the Modjeska school. And the curriculum here is about voting and jobs and world affairs and history of Negroes and politics, public speaking. It's the type of things that we're studying now or need to be studying. And they were looking for voting rights and jobs and peace and freedom, looking for health care. And so again, the history denied, we have to think that Bernie Sanders discovered the word progressive and redo it, start all over again, and not realize that we have been here before, and let's stand on the shoulders of the people that fought for it.
Brett, can I ask you a question? And this is maybe a little off topic, but maybe it's not. You just made a comment that she was kicked out because the people who were taking up the power structure were more acceptable to the white, more conservative people who are in charge. And I think as activists, that is something that we see on a regular basis.
Sure.
But having just come here, it's kind of a culture shock seeing how that is a little bit more prevalent, at least in the community that I'm in right now, as far as your activism has to be acceptable to the conservative relation. So how do we use these examples in history, or is there even a way to use these examples in history to say, you know, how do we break through that? How do we say we're going to be activists without having to make ourselves acceptable to that existing power structure? Because that is a current dilemma I am having right now.
Well, and that's a good one. I'm sorry for you, but I'm glad you're there at that point, because it's one that we have to address. And that the Progressive Network started life with a position and analysis that we can't change the system. We all agree we got to change the system. We're like not doing civilization well at all. We don't practice the democracy thing well at all. And we can't change it with the tools that broke it and keep it broken. And the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the two-party system has nothing to do with democracy. It's a scam by the people that run things. And that they're going to be in charge. And that there is a crabs in the bucket syndrome. Right now we have in South Carolina a black caucus that is no longer a black caucus. It became the Democratic caucus because our Democratic Party is majority black. Because of gerrymandering, they're a permanent minority. And so they don't have to actually get anything done. They can't get anything done. And so all they need to do is beat their chest and sound like they're doing something. And that's a problem. That's a problem because the incumbent's main job is to protect their job. And so the lack of people standing up and challenging the systemic problems, the fact that the Constitution we're working under was designed to disenfranchise people. And Tillman acknowledged that he was throwing out poor white people, but that's the best he could do. And so without understanding that and holding that up as an honorable, rational position, not some kind of left-wing wacko thing that just fell off a turnip truck in Burlington, Massachusetts, that it's a legitimate position based on South Carolina's history. And so we have come into the game saying we can't win the game with just an inside game. We can't just be involved in the existing political structure. We have to build our power with the people, with principles and truth outside the existing system. We have to build a movement. The movement for civil rights was outside of the existing structure. They forced it. Great movements have to be outside the existing structure that necessitates great movements. And so, and also remember, Modjeska told me one time I was worried about somebody, and she said, Lord child, she said, if I worried about what people thought about me, I'd never get anything done. And keep in mind now, she was vilified by everybody. Dr. Gallman, you look like you're going to say something.
I do. Along the same lines of what you're saying, I think that we very often make a mistake in concentrating on the civil rights movement and not looking at the Black Power movement and what that had to do with actually getting things done.
Thank you, sir. Tiffany, I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a longer discussion. We'll have it again at the end of the Modjeska School when we get together and figure out how do we do this? We have to develop an understanding predicated on history. We have to have an analysis that uses that for today's plans for future. And so we're not quite finished with that process yet, but we will give you a greater assurance of answering your own question by the last class. Back to you, Robert.
All right. So really with SNCC and the original SNCC rather, and what's going on in the 40s, I'm actually glad Dr. Gallman just made that comment about Black Power and Black nationalism more broadly. One of the things that you got to understand about the late 1940s is it's very tempting for us in 2020 to look back and say, oh, well, you know, you had the New Deal, then you had World War II, and then suddenly 1954, the Brown v. Board case, and then that's when the civil rights movement begins. No, there's a lot of radical organizing, grassroots organizing going on all across the South, and really throughout the country in the 1940s. In fact, one of the things about American history that I want to really push even beyond the scope of South Carolina is that most of American history is actually fairly polarized. Like you might watch the news or read the paper, people say, man, politics have never been this polarized before in American history, as though we hadn't had a civil war or something like that, or as though we hadn't had brutal riots in 1919 and 1943 and so on and so forth. American history is much more complicated, indeed much more conflict ridden than many leaders want you to realize. Because if you actually know how much American history has been a series of constant struggles and confrontation between those with power and those without power, then you might start thinking about the world 2020 a bit differently. And to that point, I do want to kind of come back to what Brett was getting at, because he's mentioned a couple of times tonight how the term progressive is being thrown around a lot right now with Bernie Sanders, and there's this sense that it's like a new thing, but it's really not. So where was I? The thing is that the South is at this really interesting fulcrum point in 1945, 46, 47, where things are very much up in the air. Really quickly, I do want to go back, and I don't want to have tonight's class be like the SNCC show, although that'd be totally okay with me because SNCC is a fascinating topic unto itself. But if you look at this photograph, right, of the conference, this is at the Township Auditorium, by the way, for those of you who don't know. If you're from Columbia or in the Columbia area, you may know where the township is. I like to joke that the Township Auditorium, if for nothing else, can lay its claim to fame to the fact that it's hosted both W.B. Du Bois and Ric Flair, but I digress. The thing about this picture, and there are no photographs of this that we know of, but if you turn the camera over away from the stage and looking out towards the audience, there were actually these large photographs, or rather paintings, that were hanging of Reconstruction era leaders. And that's because SNCC understood that people in South Carolina and around the world needed to know that South Carolina had this radical history that most people were ignoring or trying to downplay. And so, you know, things like SNCC are critically important to our understanding of how the nation is at this place of potential change. There's a term, before we go on, there's a term I want to throw out there. And this actually gets at what Brett mentioned sort of class this afternoon, or rather this evening, about what's going on right now being a time period of both considerable trauma, this considerable distress, but also a period of potential. The historian Lerone Bennett, who was editor of Ebony Magazine, was really one of the most important men in African-American history in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Lerone Bennett coined this phrase called revolutionary time. And he wrote about this during the height of Black Power. And his idea of revolutionary time is the problem with being an activist, the problem with being someone who is conscious about what's wrong with the world, is when do you decide to make your push for change? There may be moments in history where activists miss their moment. They miss their windows of opportunity. There may be other moments where activists push too hard too soon without a good game plan, without a clear vision of what's going to happen in the future, and they may fail in what they want. The late 1940s is this period where to some activists, it feels like revolutionary time. Fascism has been defeated in Europe and Asia. The United States had this experiment for a decade with the New Deal. And there are many Americans who were thinking, hey, we could push for universal health care. Hey, we could push for a guaranteed income or a guaranteed job opportunity in the 1940s. The same thing with activists pushing for an end to Jim Crow white supremacy. Now, the thing is that the white South is well aware of the fact that activists are making all these demands, all these changes. And so, as I mentioned in the chat room, the thing about white supremacy is that it doesn't stay static. It's not as though a person who believes in white supremacy in 1895 is going to have the same outlook on society as someone who believes in white supremacy in 1945. They may want the same end goals, but they may also acknowledge we're living in different contexts, different time periods. Let's pursue this differently. Now you see this, of course, with the fights over letting Black students into USC's law school. Now I mentioned that it starts in 1938 with Charles Bailey. Bailey, after a while, drops his pursuit of that endeavor. By 1947, John Wrighton decides to also apply to go to USC's law school. By 1947, folks in South Carolina understand that it's now time for them to make some small concessions. And so that particular year, the legislature allows for the creation, funds the creation of a law school at South Carolina State College in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Now, this particular law school is going to be the law school for African Americans in South Carolina from 1947 until around 1966 or so. But it's going to be important because many of the lawyers, Black lawyers in the state who are going to be prosecuting civil rights cases are going to go to this law school. Okay. All right, so Dr. Hale has actually just joined us as well. He had a meeting earlier this evening. As a fellow academic, I know that life is nothing without meeting after meeting after meeting. So Dr. Hale, welcome. I know that you wanted to spend some time talking about equalization in South Carolina education. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I was going to touch on equalization and maybe talk about Briggs for a little bit.
Oh, okay, yeah. Go ahead.
That's it. Okay. And then Dr. Greene, can I share a PowerPoint?
Oh, sure. Please, by all means. Let me go ahead and stop sharing my screen. Okay.
So then I don't know if it's going to overlap or anything, but I'll just maybe talk if you want to chime in. I don't have all that many slides. We can just sort of talk about it and then hand it back off to you. We'll just kind of.
Okay,
so Robert, John, I'll turn you on to be able to do that. Robert, you turn yours off, and Jon Hale is now. You can now share your screen, John.
And before you start, Dr. Hale, just real quick, what I want to say right now is what Dr. Hale is going to talk about is really what leads up and really what encompasses like the Briggs v. Elliott case. And I've talked this evening about some of the ways in which folks in South Carolina are pushing back against segregation, but this is perhaps the most important cog in that conversation.
So I don't know if you got to the Dixiecrats and elections of 48 and things I saw. I mean, we could go back to that after I talk about
Yes,
that.
well, we can go back to that, yeah.
Okay. All right, so it is great to see everyone, and sorry I had to join so late. Like Dr. Greene mentioned, this is my third Zoom meeting in a row, and I have another one at 8:30. So we're finding ways to stay busy as we're in quarantine. But I'm just going to go ahead and share this. Is that showing up on everyone's screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So just I want to talk about a couple of things that Dr. Greene, what I chimed in late, but heard him talking about, and also something that I see the point of the Modjeska Simkins School is that the sort of evolving role of the state in maintaining its own self-interest, but also how education works in that. At the same time, looking at how education has been used as an integral part of the civil rights movement in South Carolina. And the Briggs decision of the 1950s sort of gives us a lens by which to understand that and to sort of see how education evolves as a political platform of resistance, but then also of maintaining segregation. So Dr. Greene has mentioned John Wrighton and the case of University of South Carolina Law School, which ultimately ends with a separate and unequal law school in Orangeburg. However, Briggs, you could argue, starts with John Wrighton even a few years before that in some ways, at Avery Normal Institute in Charleston. So you can begin to see how resistance and then the counter-resistance of the state operates when you look at Wrighton, not only at USC, which I think he's very well known for, but also what he does at Avery. So when he returns from the war, the Second World War early in 1944, he finishes his degree, his high school degree, at the Avery Normal Institute in Charleston. This is not uncommon for war vets to go to war without having finished their high school diploma. It's not until 1940 where over 50% of Americans are actually complete high school. So a lot of these returning war vets are going back to school in order to go to college, and that requires going to high school to complete that degree first. So he goes to Avery, and he leads the NAACP Youth Council, and he actually leads the class of 1944 to apply to the College of Charleston. They know they're not going to get in, but the point is that they're willing to make the demand to desegregate institutions like the College of Charleston and the University of South Carolina. I say this to mention that, so here's resistance, and then there's a counter movement where the College of Charleston actually mobilizes to privatize itself. So we see the state moving toward privatizing the entire system. There's also a very influential article published by Thomas Waring, an editorial in the News and Courier, and following this movement of Wright and NAACP Youth Council, where he actually proposes, and is quite popular, to privatize the entire school system. Not much happens, but we begin to see the movement toward privatization as a viable option to avoid desegregation. Okay, so there's this sort of push and pull, this tug of war over education, what this looks like in the movement. At the same time, there's other things happening outside of this, within the state and outside of the state. So Vanessa Siddle Walker is making this argument, and she makes it very well in Hello, Professor, but her most recent book, The Lost Education of Horace Tate, which was just released. And that is Black Southern Teacher Associations, and in South Carolina, that's a Palmetto Education Association, the PEA. Their markers downtown, correct me if I'm wrong, Brett or Dr. Greene, but I think it's on Laurel Street downtown of the old Palmetto Education Association headquarters. And they actually have their teacher equalization case, the Duval case of 1943. And this is one of several Southern court cases that are equalizing the salary. So the NAACP engages upon this legal strategy to tackle segregation and to reverse the Plessy separate but equal decision through the Southern states. And this begins with the, I'm sorry, let's look at the messages here. The Lost Education of Horace Tate, Horace, Tate, Tate. Excellent book just released, which makes the argument that it was Black teachers that laid the foundation of the Brown decision. And you see this through the teacher equalization campaign of the NAACP that began in the late 1930s, that is finishing up by the 1940s. Gladys Noel Bates in 1948 from Mississippi is a last teacher equalization case. So what happens are these teachers are organizing, not only teachers, but the families. They're organizing families to step forth to put their names on these cases that are eventually going to lead to desegregation. At the same time, by 1950, the Supreme Court is already indicating, the writing is on the wall, that desegregation is going to occur. And we see this with McLaurin v. Oklahoma in 1950, which actually desegregates graduate school in Oklahoma. And then Sweat v. Painter in 1950 was just yet another decision where the Supreme Court is forcing Southern states, and Sweat v. Painter coming out of Texas, much like we have with the Wrighton case in the late 40s in South Carolina, where you either have to desegregate graduate school or you have to build a completely separate but supposedly equal case. So we see states like South Carolina adapting to this. And then, of course, all within this, this changing and evolving context of the 1940s, we have Reverend Joseph A. Delane in Clarendon County, South Carolina requests, it starts with the bus. It starts with the school bus, where they're requesting a school bus to get to a high school in, I'm forgetting the name of the high school right now, it's slipping my mind. The, Dr. Greene, do you remember it? Scotts Branch High School in Clarendon County, right? They ask for a bus. But by 1947, the case is thrown out by a technicality, right? The original lawsuit is filed outside of Clarendon County, but based on how they're assessing the taxes, so they have to refile it. But by the time that they refile it, this time beginning in first in 1950, the NAACP will only take on cases if they ask for desegregation. Okay, so they're moving from equalization to desegregation. In other words, the NAACP, the Legal Defense Fund, looks at South Carolina like they're looking at Virginia, and this court case beginning to emerge out of Topeka, Kansas, is a way to move from equalization to desegregation. And it's also, they have a string of legal success with McLaurin in Oklahoma, Sweat in Texas, and others, where they have success in desegregating graduate schools. So now in South Carolina, they say they're going to take on the court case. And here they're working with lawyers. It's not just Thurgood Marshall, right? We're also looking at Robert Carter and Spotswood Robinson, who are gaining this experience in Virginia, who are beginning to say, we're going to tackle the belly of the beast, so to speak, K-12 desegregation. So here in South Carolina, then, they begin to talk about moving toward desegregation at the level of K-12 schools. And do you see, did I switch? Here we go, yeah. So Governor Jimmy Byrnes, Jimmy Byrnes sees this coming. South Carolina legislators and legislators across the state, they see this coming. So again, we see this sort of tug of war, this back and forth between the two. We begin to see them resisting desegregation before it starts. So where South Carolina legislators were very resistant to equalizing teacher salaries, and we never reach financial parity between Black and white teachers. Now in 1950 and 51 under Jimmy Byrnes, they begin to see the writing on the wall. And here he begins to say, you know what, if the courts say in the McLaurin case, in Sweat case, and other cases that in the Wrighton case in South Carolina, if separate but equal is okay, well, let's fully fund it. So the first time in South Carolina history, Jimmy Byrnes and state legislators pushed through the first ever sales tax, a 3-cent sales tax. And they use this in order to fund an equalization program. And the map pictured here on the slide is what they published to say, here's what equalization is going to look like in the state of South Carolina. And they submit this in Charleston. They submit this in the Briggs case as evidence, as good faith effort to actually equalize schools or equalize the Plessy Edict of separate but equal. And it's a very short defense, but they submit this as evidence. And by a 2-to-1 decision in the Briggs case, which is argued in the federal courthouse in Charleston, they say, we're going to equalize our schools. Here's evidence, here's a sales tax, this is what it looks like. We're going to move forward without desegregating our schools, okay?
John, what year was the first hearing by Judge Waring on that litigation?
So it's filed,
40.
it starts in 1947, arguably beforehand when
Before the funding.
What's that?
Before the funding starts.
Before the funding starts, right? But Jimmy Byrnes and others, they're not, we like to paint these legislators as total idiots, but they're not. They're reading these court cases, they see what's happening, and they're trying to fend off what they see the writing on the wall. They're trying to stave off desegregation by equalizing the schools. But if you look closely at the map, and here I'm also going to point you to Rebecca DeBrasco's work. She's doing phenomenal work on the equalization schools. She actually charts and documents all the equalization schools that South Carolina builds throughout the entire state. This map will give you an indication of where these maps are. If you look on our website, you go county by county, and it's these, basically they're these one story, one level brick buildings with those 50s modern style windows, right? It's sort of a catch-all, and they spring up all across South Carolina. But of course, as you can tell, you would think that most of this money would go to Black schools. Unfortunately, right, we begin to see that racism does not die. in South Carolina, that this money is going to more Black schools. And in fact, we do see an increase in how many schools in South Carolina. So Nebraska cites that South Carolina spent nearly $100 million on Black school construction the first 6 years of the program, which it nearly doubles the amount of Black accredited schools in the state, from 80 to roughly 145 Black schools. So it does equalize schools. It does sort of inject financial resources into schools where it didn't exist before. However, we still see that these schools are separate but unequal. Okay, so while Briggs prompts the state to consider, they begin to consider privatization, they're looking at funding separate schools, right? What we see, however, is that the state is really just going to resist desegregation, if I may say, by any means necessary. And Briggs is really pushing the state to sort of come up with ways to stave off desegregation while they can. If I go to the next slide here, and just sort of a side note about the Briggs case, it's held in Charleston. They hear it in Charleston, and many people, granted, they're mostly South Carolina-based historians like John White, for instance. Judge Richard Gergel really tells us history as well. Is that Thurgood Marshall was resistant to come to South Carolina, sort of a rural state, not really interested in. They don't see this necessarily as, let's share this again here, as a state that can really be one of the central states in moving forward. They see Kansas, they've been developing a lot in Kansas through their youth council networks there, NAACP branches there. Virginia, right, there's a school walkout led by Barbara Johns at Prince Edward County that is becoming very significant. They have a desegregation case out in Arlington that they're drawing a lot of attention to. So South Carolina really is not on their forefront, right? But when they come to Charleston, I'm having a hard time seeing the screen. Is this, here we go. Do you see that there? The court case, the picture out of,
We do. We see Briggs v. Elliott, 1952.
This is what we see, and this is reported in the Black press throughout the nation. South Carolinians show up, right, to hear and to see Thurgood Marshall, to support the case. They know they're going to lose, right? However, they get the support. And it's in Charleston that Thurgood Marshall reportedly says, we've got this, we've won this court case. And this inspires this next slide here, this picture that Judge Gergel commissioned the artist Jonathan Greene in Charleston to paint. And you'll see this in Judge Gergel's private chambers. And you'll see a few copies throughout Charleston. I think they're starting to make their way into Columbia as well. He paints this, right, as an inspiring turning point, not only in the South Carolina civil rights movement, but the civil rights movement across the entire South and the nation as well. So we begin to see Charleston in some ways as a turning point in the civil rights movement, where we begin to see teachers that are mobilized behind the Duvall decision, but teachers and parents and families are, getting behind the NAACP. And we see this bottom-up percolation to support the NAACP. And as Briggs, that is really a turning point in many ways in the civil rights movement. And here we begin to see Briggs, again, is really the centerpiece of this tug of war between NAACP and grassroots organizers, but then also the state legislators as well. So for one, Briggs is an interesting sort of lens to understand what's going to happen after the Brown decision. So again, the writing is on the wall. Not only will the federal court, the Supreme Court and the federal government eventually support desegregation, but you can really see what resistance is going to look like after the Brown decision, right? South Carolina lawmakers have nearly a decade to prepare for it. If you count the John Wright and the Avery students petitioned to desegregate the College of Charleston in 1944, you can really see how the state's going to try to privatize their schools, and they're also going to try to equalize them rather than actually desegregating those schools. But we also see a brand of massive resistance. Pictured here in this slide is John Wrighton with his family outside of his home in Somerton. In 1950, that was burned down. They're later chased out of Lake City, South Carolina, and they eventually go to New York. It's not until 1974 where Reverend Delane comes back to the South, and that's only in Charlotte, North Carolina, but he's essentially run out of town. All of the plaintiffs in the Briggs decision are fired. They lose credit at local grocery stores. Crosses are burned in people's yards. This is massive resistance, and we see it coming. This is, in other words, presages the sort of development of the white citizens councils that we see in the summer of 1954, immediately after the Brown decision. So we see massive resistance. We see racism rear its ugly head, and we see people resisting the Briggs plaintiffs. At the same time, this sets the stage for what Kevin Cruz and Lassiter and others are calling moderate resistance, or sort of practical segregation. And this is going to be where the South Carolina legislators are finding the legal means to avoid desegregation. This is going to start in two ways in particular. One, as I mentioned, privatization. They're going to start to explore ways that they can privatize public schools with public funding. And they're also going to avoid desegregation by fully funding Black schools as a way to sort of buy off teachers as well, teachers, parents, and others, as they see an attempt to sort of buy it off. And they're not crazy for thinking this, because there is an internal debate within the Black community, and especially within the NAACP, but how do you pursue the civil rights movement and desegregation? Let's not forget, W.B. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois publishes an article in 1935 called, "Does the Negro Need Separate Schools?" And he answers unequivocally, yes. This is part of the tension that Du Bois supposedly voluntarily leaves the NAACP, but is going to really sort of create tension between Du Bois and the NAACP, because he's not supporting the desegregation initiative. Why? Because if there is a racist society who's unwilling to send white children to schools with students of color, you are never going to get a truly integrated society. So the debate is out there, in other words. So we see privatization and equalization as a method that South Carolina will use in full force after the Brown decision, but we'll talk more about that next week. And Briggs is also crucial in other ways. Briggs is, again, it sort of solidifies the NAACP's legal defense fund. And thank you for sharing that, Dr. Greene, as well, the article. They're solidifying their legal approach to focus on K-12 desegregation. So Briggs is going to be one of the 5 decisions that makes its way up to the Supreme Court, which ultimately becomes known as a Brown decision. Next week, we'll talk about why American history in the Supreme Court remembers desegregation as a Brown decision, but notice Briggs falls before Brown alphabetically. So we'll talk about why we don't notice Briggs, but we know it as Brown. So they focus on K-12 desegregation. And also, for the first time in Charleston, in the federal courthouse, we see social science evidence permitted into the courtroom as evidence, right? And this, of course, we know as the Clark's doll tests, right? So this is Mamie Clark's, based on her dissertation. She has a small handful of interviews with children in Clarendon County with dolls, where they basically point to which doll has is more favorable. Who would you rather be friends with? Which doll has, exudes more beauty, right? We can begin. They're making an argument based on psychological research, which shows, or social scientific research that shows that schools can never be equal unless they're desegregated, because segregation, in fact, creates a sense of inferiority among students of color. So Briggs, we can begin to see, is incredibly influential, not only as a way in pushing the civil rights movement forward, but with equalization, and we begin to talk about privatization a decade before Brown, we can see that South Carolina legislators are looking for the insidious means to maintain segregation by any means necessary. And again, we have the legislation already passed. So by the time the Brown decision is released, South Carolina legislators are fully ready to to resist desegregation, and they have the lawful state constitutional means to do that. And Briggs is sort of putting all of this forth. So that's all I have in terms of the Briggs decision. I might hand it over to Brett and/or Dr. Greene to sort of pick up where I left off or fill in the holes that I've created, or what have you.
So any questions for Dr. Hale from the audience this evening? That was wonderful. That was great.
Yeah, I want to say that John is a new addition to our stellar faculty, and that it's a just really significant piece of learning to understand how long, how hard, and the fight continues to be able to suppress people of color in this state.
I have a question.
I have a question.
Hello.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Okay. The names of the two initial Black women who I guess sued or had cases early on.
Yeah, so are you referring to the Duvall case?
Yes.
Yes, which is a case that emerges out of Viola Duvall is a science teacher at Burke High School in Charleston. And she's working through the Palmetto Education Association, right? Again, Vanessa Soto Walker is really, and also Rachel Devlin talks about this a little bit. It's Black teacher associations who are doing this grassroots organizing since they formed in the early 1900s to sort of equalize schools. Let's not forget, as we talked about last week, NAACP's first move in Charleston when they formed in 1917 is overturn the law, the municipal law that states that only white teachers can teach in Black schools. So they very early on take this case. So we can make the argument that Black teachers are forming the sort of basis of the civil rights movement, that they're anything but complacent. And we can see that with by the 1940s, the equalization case.
Right, thank you.
And then also, of course, Catherine Sharon's excellent biography, Freedom's Teacher, on the one and only Miss Septima Clark, who's working at, spends a lot of her teaching career at Booker T. Washington High School in Columbia. She's encouraging teachers to step forward and put their names on these court cases as well. So Black teachers are really critical to the civil rights movement, not only in South Carolina, but across the entire South.
Thank you.
My question is, it's my understanding, and I could be wrong, that early on, the people had no interest in desegregation or integration until they were convinced by the NAACP to take that. My question is, what was it about the move from equalization to desegregation that convinced the NAACP? Was it purely just a legal maneuver, or was there some type of philosophical perspective?
I think both, all the above. And then even there were some students. So if you define the NAACP's initial objectives as to overturn the Plessy decision, desegregation, right, or the separate but equal, and to restore full and equal rights to all African Americans and people of color throughout the United States, they have to overturn Plessy. And Charles Hamilton Houston determines very early on that education should be the space by which we do that. They're going to have concurrent sort of strategies with housing discrimination, for instance, and voting, of course, will be absolutely crucial. But schools can be the way to really get to the hearts and minds of Americans, because everyone with children is in a school, right? Outside of the church, it's one of the largest institutions where most people come in contact with, right? And with children, we can really sort of affect change. So it's philosophical in the sense where the schoolhouse becomes this very politicized space. In terms of a legal strategy, beginning in 1939 with the Alston v. Norfolk, as a Norfolk, Virginia case, the NAACP experienced its greatest success, not with necessarily voting rights, but housing discrimination lawsuits, but with equalization cases. So the legal precedent for Brown is established with teacher equalization cases. And Rachel Devlin, I just read this book, Fall Semester, it's called The Girl Stands at the Door, really looks at how the NAACP was relying on these Black Southern teacher associations, such as the Palmetto Education Association, to not only for fundraising, but also for identifying plaintiffs. NAACP did not have a strong presence outside of southern cities such as Columbia and Charleston. When you got to places like Clarendon County in upstate South Carolina, you really relied on the Black Teachers Association. So there was a legal strategic move to rely on teachers, and they begin to see the limitations of equalization by the Second World War, where their salaries, they increase and they're benefiting from it, but you're really not getting to equalization, right? True equalization. So they begin to realize by after the Second World War that you need to equalize. Finally, what Devlin is talking about too, is there's a string of court cases that go back to the early 1940s of families sidestepping the NAACP to sue for desegregation. So there's a handful of cases in the United States where people without the NAACP are suing school districts to desegregate. Case in point is a Mendez decision in 1947 in California, which is the country's first K-12 desegregation lawsuit, settled by the California State to Supreme Court in 1947. So and that's Mendez v. Westminster in 1947. So we begin to actually see a handful of court cases, right, that the NAACP says, you know what, we better get on this thing before we lose control of this, is one historiographical argument to make. So it's legal, it's strategic, it's philosophical, and people are actually beginning to speak up in the 1940s and say, hey, we want to go to white schools because there's no other way we can do it. That may be a long answer, sorry, but it's sort of all the above. Does that help?
Very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Welcome.
Was the case, the Duvall case, was that the one that I know that was Septima Clark was, I had thought, a moving party in that case?
Yes.
Behind the scenes, right? Behind the scenes, yeah. But she was strategic in sort of supporting the teachers, setting up, they called them, if you go through the NAACP papers, they're called retirement funds because they knew all the teachers would be fired. So yeah, that was the first case here. And every Southern state had an equivalent to that case, the Duvall case.
Well, I wanted to mention a couple of kind of anecdotal things that I think are I find interesting. In the first case with Briggs in front of Judge Waring, Elliott was the superintendent of education, Briggs v. Elliott, Briggs from Clarendon County, and Thurgood Marshall's the attorney. And Judge Waring starts off by asking the defense, because the fellow from the Attorney General's office is defending the school board, or the state school board, and he asked the attorney for the state some questions that were predicated on precedents that the federal courts had already ruled on in terms of equalization. And he would ask the state attorney, and the state attorneys, they would all be flustered and thumbing through their books to get the answer. And Thurgood would stand up and say, Your Honor, I can answer that. And he would say, sit down, Mr. Marshall. And that happened, and this is, I can't remember whether Modjeska told me this or whether I read it somewhere, but it's a great story.
It's in writing. I've seen it. It's Marjorie. I've seen it. I don't know where, but I've seen it.
Well, one of us, if we had a younger person with a brain cell, we'd remember. But the thing is it happened 3 times. And Waring says, sit down, Mr. Marshall. And the sense on our bench was that, oh my God, we're losing it. And after several times of the state not knowing what it was, Waring moved for summary judgment and said that clearly you don't know what's going on, and I find for the plaintiffs. But that kind of set the tone where Waring came out and was basically saying, and he wrote in his minority opinion, the 3-judge panel was later on that case when the state appealed, and Waring's minority opinion was the separate but equal on its face is not equal. And that was really a bold move, and also was the beginning of the end for Waring's legal career in South Carolina.
Yeah, well, right. Segregation is per se inequality, and a lot of people look at his dissenting opinion as the blueprint for, of course, the Brown decision. And you can see literally phrases taken from Waring's dissent into the Brown decision.
The other point I wanted to make, and we're at 8:18, so we want to save some time for questions and Robert to wrap up. But and John, this is, I don't know if I've ever asked you this, but I will let you respond before anybody else does. I believe that the reason that the United States and the world knows the end of the Plessy case and the Brown versus Board ending public segregation as Brown, as opposed to Briggs, was Jimmy Byrnes. And see, Jimmy Byrnes was, at that point, had stepped down from the Supreme Court, and this case came to the Supreme Court. And there were 4 cases. I can't remember, other than Briggs and the Topeka case, what the other 2 were. But the way I've heard it was that the 2 things. One, that Jimmy Byrnes's argument was, this was in '54. He may have been, he was governor then, I think. So he's back in South Carolina, and he's trying to defer heat. And he basically does not want South Carolina's name on this case. And the Topeka case was much less egregious than the Clarendon County case. And so everybody in the world would know, not Brown versus the Board, but Briggs v. Elliott, had it not been for Jimmy Byrnes's heavy hand on the scale of history.
Well, it's funny moving to, so you probably can tell from my accent, I'm not from South Carolina.
You're not from around here, are you, boy?
Not from these parts. I'm from Wisconsin, and then I studied at University of Illinois. And we learned the interpretation that and Kluger talks about this, right? Richard Kluger in his voluminous Simple Justice, over in my bookshelf, it's massive book, right? That really it's called Simple Justice, but it's a must read. I think, Robert, Dr. Shaw, is it 750, 800 pages? It's like the Bible for legal history and the Brown decision.
Yeah, it's long enough.
Yeah, it's hard to write.
Well, I'm glad you read it.
So, but they're making the case that Frankfurter and others the Supreme Court justice wanted to pick the case to show that it was a national problem, right? That all the other cases were coming from either the South or former slave-owning states like Delaware, right? Or the problematic cities like DC, which is all but the South. Topeka, Kansas was the only court case of the 5 that was coming out outside of the slave-owning states and confederacies. So one story is that one way to interpret this history and the record is to show that the Supreme Court justice wanted to show this was a national issue because in the United States, we generally fall under the impression that the North, like freedom North, that somehow things are in the North is somehow free, or that it's freer, right? Or that they don't practice segregation. But that could not be further from the truth. Let's not forget that Dr. King, before he died, said that one of the worst cities that he organized was in the city of Chicago, right? And that was after, being harassed, stabbed, assaulted in the South. He comes to Chicago and he's getting bricks thrown at him in the suburbs, right? So they wanted to show that segregation was a national problem. Moving down to the South, there's more colorful interpretations. One is that Jimmy Byrnes is so incredibly powerful that he does not want South Carolina's name on that. And then given that, Dr. Greene, anyone wants to chime in? I don't know how many Supreme Court justices actually step down from the bench because they're too bored to go back to their states they came from and to become governor. And he's one of the only ones, if not the only one.
Yeah, he's a rarity, that's for sure.
So he's incredibly influential. So I think that interpretation does, Brett, make a lot of sense that he could in fact do that. I also heard the case in Judge Gergel, and by the way, Judge Gergel, I'm going to put the title of his new book in there. Unexampled Courage. It was released last year. It was positively reviewed in the New York Times. That could turn some people off, but excellent book. Talks about that they were, one person even says that they were late in registering the Briggs decision for that. So it wasn't on the docket in the way that Brown was. So you hear several sort of maybe some conspiracy theories and others, but I don't know. I think there's great value to show that Jimmy Byrnes wanted to keep South Carolina's name off it, because one can imagine what it would be like if it was known as a Briggs decision instead of Brown. So I like to be creative and say, you know, there's value in memory and how we tell that story that we don't want, you know, Briggs was intentionally left off it. So I think the record points to the justices wanted a Northern example because it was a Northern problem. But I think there's great value in the interpretation that Jimmy Byrnes was going to do everything to keep South Carolina off that.
I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
So the question is, what would have happened had, and this is an unanswerable question, but what would have happened had those people fighting for equalization won instead of the fight turning towards desegregation? And the reason I ask this is because being indoctrinated, you know, in South Carolina schools from kindergarten to high school, and speaking with my first mentor in high school, who was or who is an African-American man, you know, 30 years my elder, and talking about, you know, the narrative that I had been told about integration, for one, because there was no distinguishing between integration and desegregation, how great it is, and now we're here together, and you're my mentor, and kumbaya, and all of this. And he stopped me and he said, you know, one of the worst things that happened in my life was when my high school was integrated. And he proceeded to tell a story of how in Summerville, South Carolina, when his all-Black high school was forced to integrate, what ended up happening is that they lost their mascot, like basically like the white power structure, and this was sometime in the 1970s of South Carolina, probably pressured by the federal government. But in any case, how the white power structure, because it ended up controlling desegregation, made Black students like him, and then continues to make Black South Carolinians, you know, I myself as a public teacher see this, second-class citizens in the schools that were sites, to go back to Dr. Gallman's point, of Black power and refuge from racism, because these were schools that were run, you know, and I'm sharing this, you know, as a question, but also, you know, correct me where I'm wrong, but were run by Black teachers, Black principals, like these were sites of Black power. Not to say that it, you know, that it wasn't, you know, abhorrent, you know, the actual physical conditions of these schools, but it's just a very, you know, I'm not on the boat anymore of integration being such a good thing. And honestly, the way that it played out, and I'll just make one last point that, you know, so, you know, I'm a white teacher in a country now that where 80% of teachers are white, and the public school population is reflective of the country, very multiracial, not 80% white. And whenever this discussion of why that situation is, you know, like the state of affairs of this is mentioned, what is never mentioned is these fights, and I'm so grateful for this class for this, around equalization versus desegregation, where, you know, what actually ended up happening, in my understanding of the history, correct me if I'm wrong, is that as this panned out in places like South Carolina, 80% or more of the Black teachers, superintendents, staff were fired and then replaced by a mostly white teaching, administrative, superintendent staff. So when we talk about, you know, today when people talk about, you know, these issues of, you know, why is there so many more white teachers in education, for as one example, you know, why is there this imbalance, this racial imbalance in terms of teachers versus students? It's without this historical memory or discussion, of course, intentionally, as if like the issue is that teachers of color, you know, people of color don't want to be teachers, not that there was an intentional, policy-based, you know, aggressive mass firing of teachers of color in places like South Carolina, and or demotion. You know, I could go on and on. So, but you have so many questions and comments about, you know, these questions around desegregation and integration.
Could I share my experience?
We know you're going to.
I was hoping there was somebody old enough to speak to that, Dr. Gorman.
Yeah, actually, I was a member of the last class to graduate from segregated Butler High School in Hartsfield, South Carolina. And I went to school there from kindergarten until 12th grade. After graduating from Benedict, I actually taught for a year before going to medical school. What they did, and that was in the 70-71 school year, what they did was they pulled what they considered to be the best Black teachers and sent to the white high schools. They sent some of the lesser regarded white teachers and sent to the Black school, along with new teachers such as myself. They hired a series of weak principals so that the community actually called more for integration because their children were not getting good education because of the weakness. What's interesting, my father had been principal of that same school, well, long before I went there, because he retired prematurely because of health reasons. And he had actually been president of the PEA, I heard that mentioned earlier, and had instituted some programs around trying to prevent teachers from being fired for being members of the NAACP, because that was one of the things that actually was happening frequently. I think, Ms. Dawson, I agree with your teacher. One of the worst things to happen in the Black community was integration. As long as it was desegregation, in my mind, I see those two terms as being different. Because all of a sudden, because the teachers were teaching from their own perspectives, the water at the white schools became wetter. The ice at the white schools became colder, and it formed a way of thinking in many of the students. My mother actually retired from Hartsville Junior High, very sorrowful, because at Butler High School, she was revered as a teacher who was tough, but who cared about the students. And to this day, her former students that are still living often contact me to talk about that. At the white school, she was considered by the Black students to be a mean teacher because she insisted on them doing their work when other of the teachers there were merely patting the students on the head and passing them on to the next grade without requiring them to do what was necessary in order to achieve the knowledge. So I think that integration created a mindset in the Black community that was very, very destructive. And whereas I remember individuals who went to school looking forward to starting their own businesses, it became someone who graduated wanting to get a good job and work for someone else and help make them wealthy. I could go on and on, but I won't.
I want to go ahead. This is a fascinating conversation. However, it is 8:33. So I think it'd be best if we pick this up next week, because this actually leads straight into our discussion of Brown v. Board, some of the things going on in the state in the 50s and 60s. But I do want to pick up this conversation next week. And by the way, I think to both Julia and Dr. Gallman points about the difference between desegregation and integration and the way we see education. This could be at the heart of your project that, you know, hopefully by the end of our term, you can begin thinking about, well, what kind of work do I want to do as part of the Progressive Network?
I'll wait till next week and comment on the social aspects of what happened, according to Julia, when the gentleman said to you, I lost my mascot, and how significant that was to many of the people, young folks particularly, that I've worked with.
I'm worried we won't remember it next week. Go now.
Remember?
Take us home.
Okay. Well, again, I went to northern schools, but I've got lots of friends in the South, and I had my Southern experiences every summer with my respective grandmothers. And so I heard some of those stories about what happened when literally the social fiber of the community vis-a-vis the young people was literally destroyed. They were no longer the cheerleaders. They were no longer the heads of the football teams. They were no longer miss this, miss that. And that impacted on their educational experience also, because they weren't recognized for the kinds of things that they brought to the class. So the destructiveness could not have been imagined in terms of a sociology point of view. My other experience has to be with a group of prisoners, because I worked in corrections. And the other, that there was a set of young inmates particularly who could also reflect on how negative they looked at their schools, because they saw them as being hostile. And it was because there was no one Black or no one who regarded their existence. And so again, your point was very well taken. And that observation has got to be examined over and over again in terms of how we develop healthy people. So much.
Thank you, Marjorie. Robert, you want to mention that we're going to be doing some more chat sessions where some of these important things can be explored, like off curricula, where we can focus on one or two things that people are interested in.
Yeah, we're gonna try to do some chat sessions later this week to kind of discuss these things, because obviously 2 hours over Zoom is not quite enough. But we'll get more details out about that fairly soon.
Is anybody out there going to pop if they don't say something? Okay, they're smiling. We're going to say bye-bye, bye-bye. Stay safe and study.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank y'all.
Everyone, take care.
Good night and good luck.
Those people. Lovely people.
Good night. Thank you, everyone.
Wow.
Good night. Thank you.